This is Duke University.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ranji Khanna, and I am delighted to welcome you to this event on monument as concept and as object in the FHI. The ideas for a series that we're putting together here that was originally going to be all this semester, but I think it'll probably also be roll on to next semester, were developed partly in conversation with the Volia Glimp, who I think is going to come at some point, who will be hosting a conference on topics related to monumentality too, on the topic of the university and slavery. So events over the last year locally, some of which have come to a head this week with dismissals and verdicts of not guilty, specifically in relation to Confederate monuments in Durham and at Duke, have been the occasion to think through what kind of a thing a monument is. What is a monument? What have been and remain the local, regional, and international debates around monuments? What can we take from the fact that in the same year the Confederate flag was removed from the State House grounds of South Carolina, the bronze statue of Cecil Rhodes was removed from the grounds of the University of Cape Town, South Africa's oldest university, and also the 112-year-old statue of Queen Victoria that stands outside the City Library in Port Elizabeth was vandalized. In addition, in January 2017, a statue of Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist philosopher, aesthetician, literary historian, and critic, was removed from its site in Budapest. And in the 1990s, filmmakers and philosophers were examining how to deal with the massive and numerous statues of Lenin and Stalin in Russia, while monuments to the fortitude of Nelson Mandela were going up everywhere. What are the aura that remains around disgraced monuments? Is the museum or the graveyard the appropriate site for them? In the middle of last century, architectural historian Siegfried Gideon and architect Joseph Sert wrote a document entitled 9 Points on Monumentality. This was from 1943. And in that document, they bemoaned the trivialization of monumentality in architecture over the preceding 100 years. They looked forward at that point to a renewed investment in the true significance of the monumental, proposing it as a concept rather than as a series of structures that were inadequate to that concept in their view. Quote, monuments are human landmarks which men have created as symbols for their ideals, for their aims, and for their actions. They are intended to outlive the period which originated them and constitute a heritage for future generations. As such, they form a link between the past and the future. And they continue in ways that further elaborate on the desire and effective investment in the monument. Quote, monuments are the expression of man's highest cultural needs. They have to satisfy the eternal demand of the people for translation of their collective force into symbols. The most vital monuments are those which express the feeling and thinking of this collective force, the people, they wrote. The monument, then, is not just a representation, but also an embodiment of desire and aspiration of the people, apparently. Monument marks a people's ambition, triumphs, and tragedies. And yet, as we know, the people have been often far less than unified, nor do they have a common desire for commemoration or are agreed about which ideals or aims should be memorialized. In addition, the state's role in creating and destroying monuments, sometimes in ignorance and sometimes in support of the desires of their people, has, as we know, been far from consistent. So today we have, in addition to monuments, we have numerous structures internationally that we refer to as anti-monuments or counter-monuments, structures or structured orifices that encapsulate the desire to make some forms of representation absent. Yuliya Komska, our speaker today, is Associate Professor of German at Dartmouth College. Her book, The Icon Curtain, The Cold War's Quiet Border, was published by Chicago University Press in 2015, and it deals with the manner in which a change in the imagined landscape comes into play with the Cold War, with the Sylvan territory of dense forests had to negotiate with a harsh image of an iron curtain. An already dense and religiously charged image of a border changed its nature, and Komska works through a variety of different materials to elaborate on this change. Last summer, she wrote a very interesting op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post about Confederate monuments. What to do with Confederate monuments, 7 lessons from Germany, which asks both for specific questions about Confederate monuments and analyzes what the post-World War II and post-89 context may teach us. Komska's ability in thinking through the role and meaning of icon, iconoclasm, and iconicity, as well as the role of language in relation to monumentality, which has been noted in the history of literature repeatedly, of course, made her an obvious choice to come and speak to us today. The title of her talk is With Monuments, Does Language Matter? The Case of Germany. Please join me in welcoming her to Duke.
Hello, please let me know if I don't come through very clearly. I wanted to begin by thanking Ranjana very kindly for the kind introduction and also for inviting me here, and Sarah Rogers for organizing the visit so beautifully, and to all of you for coming. And by way of a preface, I'll just say that this talk was, so I was brainstorming about how to pitch this in the best way and also in the most open way, and have decided that it sounds very silly to be coming to a place, and I'm coming from New Hampshire right now, which has no dearth of Confederate flags hanging, but it doesn't have many or any Confederate monuments within the state itself. So I was thinking for how to talk respectfully about the removal of Confederate monuments in the place where people are actually dealing with their removal. And it struck me that I didn't necessarily want to come in and talk about how to theorize them, but talk about some of the more practical aspects for what to do with them. And language struck me as a very practical aspect in this regard. And I must say that some of that, the lens of language with which I come to the topic, comes out of having written a book with 2 colleagues that's supposed to be out this summer. It's called Linguistic Disobedience, and deals with how to parlay language that we use every day into a kind of civic language, and how to do this specifically in the era of Trump, who has sort of hijacked every trace of linguistic disobedience for himself and claimed it for himself. So what is left for us? What do we have? What resources remain? Absolutely. And I think what struck us, by having finished the book, is the realization that in America there has been a misunderstanding in the conversation going on about civic language. People have talked a lot about American English, and I mean since the founding fathers, but they haven't actually talked about an inclusive civic language. So this was the lens that I wanted to bring to the topic today, and start with words. For an Anglophone American, it is easy to forget that the English word monument comes from Latin monere, meaning simply to remind. Latin isn't commonly taught anymore, thanks in part to such founding fatherly figures as Noah Webster. The humble etymology has fallen prey to obscurity. The events leading up to August 2017, when the outcry over the Confederate statues intensified in many places, hasn't lifted the veil. And while questions about what monuments mean have abounded, not too many have asked what the word monument means and what is at stake at using it or not. Consequently, the word didn't appear on any of the Word of the Year shortlist, which dictionaries, dialect societies, or high-profile language blogs compile based on lookup frequency or user nominations. And so we can assume the humble origin, a reminder, has failed to register anew, or to ring a bell, perhaps. Dictionary definitions make few nods in this direction, even as they mention the derivation on the very bottom of the entry, as you see here, and that's pretty inconvenient for our short attention spans, because who possibly looks to the very bottom of the entry when reading. The Oxford English Dictionary's definitions read, number 1, a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a notable person or event. 2, a statue or other structure placed over a grave in memory of the dead. 3, a building, structure, or site that is of historical importance or interest. 4, an enduring and memorable example of something. The adjective monumental strays even further afield, being defined, grandiloquently rather, as of great importance, extent, or size, and I'm quoting, stupendous or massive and permanent. It is then unsurprising that architect Louis Kahn's influential 1944 notion of monumentality as, and I quote, a spiritual quality inherent in a structure which conveys the feeling of its eternity, that it cannot be added or changed, end quote, is as remote from a simple reminder as can be. And so is, in fact, the conflation that keeps haunting us of monumentality and size, and it keeps doing that against the admonitions of many an architect, and the Swiss architect Peter Meyer has been quite prominent in trying to debunk it, and many others have joined him as well, or since perhaps the late 1940s. But it's been really hard to take down this parallelism between monumentality and grandeur, or monumentality and bigness. Just the sheer size has been very large, pardon the pun. The verbal predicament, if we think about it, carries over onto the terms devised to question monumentality of both stolid classicism and sterile modernism. And this is in reference also to some of the texts that Ranjana has already introduced. A real-life physical counter-monument or anti-monument, for example, might indeed disperse memory and point to its contingency and impermanence, as James Young notes. It may indeed, as public performance art studied by art historian Mechthild Widrich, pivot on interactional impermanence, as she calls it, but as a word, counter-monument remains bogged down in the same semantic conundrum as monument, meaning literally an anti-reminder. Of course, there are also synonyms, mostly also Latinate. Statue, from Latin stare or stand, is similarly opaque. Memorial is a bit more helpful, since obviously tied to memory. The Anglo-Saxon landmark or marker are perfectly comprehensible, but have little to do with reminders and more with what historian Omer Bartov has called territorial writ. The rest, such as gravestone, headstone, cenotaph, stele, mausoleum, shrine, are simply too specific. What does this mean? Nothing extraordinary at first blush. The word monument and its cognates have evolved. They have been transformed by the semantic sediments that accrue to many words over time. Fair enough. At the same time, however, these words have become ossified, half-comprehensible, non-negotiable. They offer little in the way of lexemes to play with, to form new words with, to ponder, to challenge. And the sad reality, we could perhaps say, is that the definition of a monument, perhaps, and the practice of monuments has changed quite a bit, but our language to talk about them hasn't really changed at all, at least in the English sphere. And this is the paradox. In the past quarter century or so, vernacular memory, that is, the stories that ordinary people tell about the past, and it's distinct from public or official memory that governments or institutions chaperone, has garnered quite a bit of attention. By contrast, very little has been written about any of these memories' proper vernacular, that is, about the language that ordinary people used to talk about commemoration. The debates on what to do about monuments now have, to my knowledge, been silent on the subject of language, or nearly so. The question then is, does America presently lack a vernacular to talk about the material culture of remembrance? Is it possible to have a conversation about the topic without such a language, to interrogate with half-significant, half-understood words? Furthermore, can it be that this verbal gap contributes to the difficulty of confronting the racist past? Does the country need this vernacular? And if so, what would it look like? These are deliberately polemical questions that I'm questions that I'm throwing out there, in full admission that I myself don't have many or any answers. Now, at stake, to note here, isn't a case of what some would call xenologophobia, the fear of foreign words. Nor is it advocacy of transparent language, a la George Orwell, who memorably lambasted the slovenly and pretentious Latinate style, instructing his adepts to never use a foreign phrase, and I'm quoting right now, a scientific word or a jargon word if it can be replaced with an everyday English equivalent, end quote. There is no plea here that I'm making for more monolingualism where there is already quite enough of it. Foreign words, not only the recent imports, but the half-accepted old-timers are a necessity. Not only do they provide precision, variety, and elegance, although on this matter opinions differ, when they stick out like a sore thumb, when we stumble over them repeatedly, these half-ingested borrowings can index society's larger unresolved problems. They can be symptoms of the human condition. And I will quote, "The more alienated human beings have become from their things in society, the more strange are the words that will have to represent them," Theodor Adorno wrote in the 1930s. However, being half assimilated is not the issue with words like monument or statue. On the contrary, they may have been assimilated a bit too well. We don't stumble on them anymore. They hardly stick out, but they're no more comprehensible or meaningful for that. The question about the need for a vernacular, by which I mean an idiom that's as meaningful as it's varied, flexible, and inclusive, is also not much one of linguistic relativity. That is the belief that language in the theory in linguistics, the belief that language co-determines the speaker's reality. It is rather about having a vibrant, dynamic vocabulary that facilitates the constant questions that ultimately keep not only memory, but the awareness of memory alive. And so, at long last, on to Germany. There, the terms to talk about monuments emerged as vernacular in the most literal sense, in contradistinction to both Greek and Latin. Dictionaries suggest that it was Martin Luther who made up the German word for monument, which is Denkmal, along with a few others, such as Donnerkeil, Thunderbolt, and Ehrgeiz, ambition, in his attempt to vernacularize German and get away from Latin being spoken in church, specifically in translating the Vulgate for the masses, as it were, the reading masses, whatever that meant at the time. He used the word no fewer than 3 times in his 1523 translation of the Old Testament, however, not in reference to any built structures, but to memory aids or written reminders, what we would now call memos, more or less. This was in line with its use in Latin, or one of its meanings in Latin at least. And indeed, this shade of meaning, that is, a written record, also appears in some older English dictionaries, but becomes scarce altogether, vanishes in current editions. Only in the 17th century would Denkmal receive its more modern meaning, although the earlier connotation will be documented well into the 18th century. And in terms of, by way of a comment on this slide in particular, it's of course stunning that Germans now advertise the word Denkmal as the creation of the Reformation, yet at the same time the Reformation was also quite famous as an extremely iconoclastic event that wiped out imagery in many a place. And here you see an image made to document the power of pilgrimages and what they do in society, with a handwritten note on the bottom by Albrecht Dürer, who owned a copy of it, tearing down the practice of idolatrous Catholic pilgrimages. And of course, Dürer was a spokesperson for the Reformation as well. And so there is this very tense, fraught relationship between the invention of the word Denkmal in German, which is the predominant word to use for monument, as I will discuss shortly, and the actual practice of the period that it came out of. Several things distinguished Luther's coinage from the Latin monumentum, which had served as the inspiration. First of all, Denkmal has 2 rather than 1 meaningful parts hinged together in a composite. Consequently, these parts could exist independently and be mobile, producing new combinations, as we'll see in a second. One was Denk, from denken, to think. The other one was mal, the noun, to mean a distinguishing mark, also used to describe a skin discoloration, akin to a mole or a birthmark. And the word for that is mutamal, muta being mother. I apologize in advance for this very strange word cloud that a word cloud generator has produced. It's more like a thunderbolt. I don't know what Luther would say about this. But artificial intelligence is perhaps not something to entrust word to yet at this point. So let's talk about some of these words for a little bit. So Denkmal is related to Wundmal, which you will see here, and that means a stigma, and the word Denkmal derives, and Mal derives from a fusion of two closely Old and Middle High German words, Mal and Meil, meaning spot, sign, sin, and shame. And the latter eventually becomes part in a word Schandmal, which means a mark of shame, and it will haunt the rest of this discussion when I talk about a specific monument. Broken down into these parts, the composite hinted at an entity that is indeed permanent and difficult to erase, as we've heard before, but decidedly unmonumental in terms of scale and possibly extremely uncomplimentary by definition because it has sin and shame already sort of built in. A field of related words, most of which you see here, would develop around it. And that's another distinguishing feature, including Ehrenmal and Mahnmal, both usually translated as memorial, dominating the conversation about memory since the 19th century. Denkmal is supposed to commemorate a person or an event, whereas Mahnmal, from the verb to reprimand, mahnen, ought to act as a public warning. Finally, the word Denkmal specifically has no single stable plural form, alternating between either Denkmäler or Denkmale, often used by the same author in the same text, interchangeably. So, in effect, you're constantly forced to think about denken and mal as they appear in these different coinages, and they're also kind of marked by instability. The instability is important, as it creates occasion for negotiation and questioning. In addition, of course, there are words like Gedenkstätte, one you see here, which is a place of remembrance and meditation, Gedenkstein, memorial stone. All this is to say that although the word monument does exist in German, it is entirely possible to have a conversation about monuments without mentioning monumentality once. Let's now see why this branched out and unstable vernacular can matter where specific monuments are concerned. We start with Thuringia in Germany's east, and of course, also in the capital of what Andreas Huyssen has dubbed monument mania, Berlin. On November 22nd, 2017, and those of you who are Germanists will probably know this, or are very likely to know this, an uninvited monument sprouted overnight in the sleepy Thuringian village of Bornhagen. From a bedroom window of his spacious home, on a hillside padded with season-worn grass, Björn Höcke stared at 24 gray concrete stelae on his neighbor's adjacent lot. They stunned this quiet and well-liked man who, locals say, often takes his 4 kids sledding in the winter. The blocks had certainly not been there the day before, at least he didn't notice them. But now that they were there, their appearance wasn't entirely unfamiliar, because the stele replicated to scale a segment of Berlin's memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe, rotated in 180 degrees relative to Höcke's house. So we're going back 10 months. On January 18th, 2017, Höcke, one of Germany's foremost right-wing politicians, had spoken in Dresden in front of the young members of his party, the Alternative for Germany, or AfD. Memory was his topic. And I will quote, "We Germans, that is, our people," and he uses the word Volk, "are the only people in the world to plant a monument to shame amid its capital," he said, finger pointing at the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, and that's the slide on your right. "We need nothing but a memory political 180-degree turn," he added, "away from German history as wretched and laughable and toward the great achievements of our ancestors." End quote. Applause broke out in the room. Public outrage ensued outside. The party apologized, but did nothing to banish Höcke, and the incident was soon forgotten. Though not by the Berlin-based performance group that calls itself Center for Political Beauty, responsible for conjuring up that little 180-degree turn right outside Höcke's Bornhagen home. The collective's provocative work had gained notoriety long before. On the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2014, its members had temporarily stolen cross-shaped monuments for the Berlin Wall victims to install them at Europe's borders and thus protest the treatment of refugees. And this has caused quite a bit of an outcry and resulted in very many lawsuits that the center has waged for, in effect, the freedom of art across Germany, and was condemned by very many politicians and became this very fraught issue because they had to defend themselves against the claim that they dishonored real German victims of the division of Germany in order to buttress the cause of refugees. And granted that a lot of Germans had been refugees in the Cold War, this may not have been the most felicitous parallel or the most felicitous contrast to make. So they were quite on the defensive, but so far they have won every single lawsuit in their favor. Like that earlier occasion, the installation at Höcke's house garnered worldwide publicity. Visitors appeared, marveling at the stele made of actual concrete rather than plywood, painted over. The spot was easy to find. One only had to follow the handmade cardboard sign, "Memorial open, stop by," at the bottom of the hill. Of course, Höcke's supporters attempted to chase the onlookers away, and the politician filed and lost a lawsuit in the provincial court. In the treasury of the Center for Political Beauty, meantime, there is enough money to keep the installation in place for 7 long years to come. So they basically bought the adjacent lot and secured and did the setup and the installation in a way that it abided by every single code of building within the village itself and the province as well. And Germany is a federated system, for those of you who are not Germanists or German historians, and so it's very much devolved from the center in terms of these individual decisions. And in fact, it's becoming a problem with regard to a party like AfD, because some provinces, and I think Lower Saxony is the most vivid example, have actually decided that monument protection should be also a cause for political parties, and so they've allowed a representative of every party that's sitting in the parliament onto so each province, I'm going to have to back up once more, each province has something like a foundation for the preservation of monuments. And it's usually a consultational committee that has political representatives from the arts, intellectuals, and so on. So in Lower Saxony, there was a rule passed or a law passed in 2004 that allowed every single political party that's represented in the provincial government a seat on such a foundation. And so, of course, now the AfD, the right-wing party, is in the parliament, and so its member is now on the committee of the foundation. And of course, Bergen-Belsen is one of the concentration camps that has a memorial there. And of course, AfD, the right-wing political party, isn't known for its willingness and desire to commemorate the Holocaust, as this particular incident already shows. So there is quite a bit of tension around that right now in terms of legal issues as well. What can this story mean but a triumph of memory in Germany, however, to back up to this very lively resurrection of the memorial in Berlin in the German provinces? So what can this be but a triumph of memory in Germany, and also a triumph of the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe as this memory's long-time crucible? Surely the beginnings of that landmark, and this is the one on your right, were embattled, smack in the center of Berlin's government quarter, and also on what used to be the headquarters, or sort of the lair of Hitler's bureaucracy in the middle of Berlin. The undulating field of 2,700 stele, so not 24 as we see in Bornhagen, but many, many more. And an underground information center designed by the famed architect Peter Eisenman seemed like a gamble at first. So it had a very long history, and I can probably go into that in the question period if there is interest in that. The critics, of which there were many, and not necessarily the critics of Eisenman's project, but the critics of this centralized memory agglomerated in Berlin, they protested against this top-down orchestration of this kind of remembrance, which was also sanctioned specifically or approved by the large majority of the German parliament in 1999. They voiced fears of false closure, of faceless modernist abstraction, and of the Holocaust's redemption in the land of perpetrators by way of false closure. creating a site that would suggest a site so big, so vast, it's almost 5 acres of land, that there would be no need for having more of a conversation about genocide and various aspects of genocide, not only killing the Jews, but also killing other populations that the Nazis have persecuted. No country before Germany, even the jury member James E. Young admitted, had yet deposited its memory of its crimes quite so centrally. Seen from Bonhagen now, however, those apprehensions seem overblown because, lo and behold, these stele, which seem so dead and centralized and perhaps lacking any kind of humanity, which a critic of modernism could very easily say that they're negative form, just pure negative form. There's nothing that's, there are no names here, even though Maya Lin, who was the architect of the famous Vietnam Memorial in DC, was on the committee, so the names are not engraved here. And that was the original design. The original design, approved in 1995 and then discarded, called for a giant gravestone, basically. It was a gravestone that was bigger than any kind of stone that's installed in the world, with the names of 4.5 million Jewish victims killed in the Holocaust. And it would be propped up by another big stone, and there would be boulders from Israel brought to kind of indicate the stones that you would place in a Jewish grave there. And so that design was discarded as disrespectful, or sort of the caricature of what you would have as a monument to Jewish memory, or a Jewish memory are orchestrated by Germans in this kind of a very falsely monumental, inflated way. So this monument has been subjected to similar criticism, but look, it's alive and well and is performing some kind of function in society, as this protest seems to show. So this view seems to live up to the task. It propagates the memory of the Holocaust rather than consigning it to oblivion as feared. It works by generating controversy, and that was, after all, the effect anticipated at the unveiling ceremony in Berlin in 2005. So when this was unveiled, the then president of the German Parliament prophesied that it will become a center of controversy many a time, and he added this is not the worst of prospects. So on location in Berlin, too, the human scale of the monument is persuasive, the initially skeptical jury member Young finds in his 2016 book, The Stages of Memory. Where, and I'm quoting, the monumental has traditionally used its size to humiliate viewers into submission, Young reminisces, with a nod to the Nazis' oversized architectural ambitions, we believed that this memorial, in its humanly proportioned forms, would put people on an even footing with memory. Visitors and the role they play as they move knee or chest or shoulder deep into this unevenly sloping grid of stones would not be diminished. Looking up and down the pitched rows of stele, one catches glimpses of other mourners, he writes. At the same time, however, one feels very much alone, end quote. So far, so good. Except there is the rub in this sort of triumphalist narrative of a monument, of a monument's victory, if you will. Within months of Young's book publication, a flurry of selfies taken at the memorial and posted on social media offered that not all visitors were on the same page with the author. In fact, a staggering number of them weren't. The somewhat forbidding forest of stele which Young spoke of didn't appear forbidding to all. For many, the assemblage triggered no mourning and no commemorative reverence. A man juggled pink balls. A woman stretched in a yoga pose. A group of friends leaped from one stele onto another. And for a long time, many articles covering the monument in the German press were asking, well, do people actually know what the heck is going on in these 5 acres, smack in the middle of Berlin, which is also a fairly touristy part of Berlin. And so the Israeli-German writer Shahak Shapira collected these and other photographs on his website called Holocaust. If one hovered over an image, and this is what you see here, the process of hovering, it would transform the background from the memorial into a scene from a concentration camp, as a sobering reminder about the thoughtlessness of the hashtag YOLO. The degree of detail that I've given here about the memorial is not to single it out as the most important or most original commemorative project in reunified Germany. The Stolpersteine, or stumbling blocks, and you see an example here from Hamburg. So when in 1939 there was a decree that practically ousted Jews from the apartments that they owned and congregated them in these Judenhäuser, which is the name for Jew house, quite literally in German, to make sure that German residents and new German residents coming in from places like South Tyrol, for instance, have spaces that they could move into. And so these are specifically related to some of the research that I'm currently doing, which is a biography from Hamburg. And you see, you probably all know what they are because they've been also covered in American press quite extensively. And there was actually an op-ed in the Washington Post from an American historian last week, I think, about whether it's worthwhile for Americans to think about this kind of a project here and what this project is. So Stolpersteine means stumbling blocks. They're scattered across Germany. There are right now 610 places, all across Germany and Europe, actually, to commemorate the victim's last place of residence. And it lists, every Stolperstein would list the name, basically putting names on victims and the fate and birth dates if they're known. And they have generated a great deal of civic engagement because a community has to sign up to do this, and they have to collect the money. Each one such brass plaque costs 120 euros. They have to maintain them, and also is generated a vast archive of knowledge about these Jewish victims and researching Jewish history post-Holocaust. The greatest irony you find, of course, is that this kind of research from Stolpersteine and also any kind of restitution papers are the only sources of knowledge about the fates of these victims that we now have. So this particular commemorative project, which is extremely decentered and has been praised for that, has generated these very powerful impulses and perhaps can be seen as more successful than the more monumental Stele centralized in Berlin. But I have sketched out the two divergent vectors in the Berlin Memorial's trajectory, its ability to prop up memory on the one hand and oblivion on the other, to address the gaps and oversimplifications in the story of Germany's commemorative successes, as it's too often heard in present-day America. Burdened with a past as heavy as lead, what can Germany possibly offer other countries by way of lessons or even prescriptions? It is a popular question nowadays. A set of equally popular complementary answers has grown around it. So popular that they appear almost scripted, rehearsed, suspiciously homogeneous. It is difficult, if not impossible, to get a major or any news outlet to publish anything critical about the German case, and I've tried. And yet, this is where the example is most instructive. So to go back to the positive signification of German memory in current American media, what stands out is that Germans have not shied away from their difficult heritage. That's what we often hear. Their monuments have become important instruments in mastering or confronting the past, as the unwieldy composite Vergangenheitsbewältigung is usually translated. In recent decades, and here I'm quoting eminent historian Richard Evans, who wrote this, I think, in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, and that's the quote, Germany has accomplished an undeniably impressive feat, a collective acceptance of moral responsibility for the terrible crimes of its recent past. The country has given material expression to this acceptance by preserving physical traces of the Nazi era and building fresh memorials to its victims. These memorials serve more than a symbolic function in the face of increasingly influential far-right groups and parties that reject contemporary German norms of tolerance, seek an end to what they consider the shaming of Germans, and encourage pernicious forms of historical revisionism. These monuments to the past act as constant, unavoidable, and visceral reminders of the truth. End quote. This is the dominant view. But what is the past? And what are its traces? And are its traces by necessity the unavoidable reminders that we imagine them to be? It is with regard to these two questions that language matters the most. To begin answering the first, let's picture a city where over time neglect, war, or catastrophe strip layer after layer. It is shatteringly easy to do, with scores of such cities all around us, besieged by militants, lashed by hurricanes, shaken by earthquakes. Now let's fathom the opposite. Every landmark, every monument from every period survives. Maybe these evergreen relics teeter on top of one another precariously. Maybe they jostle for space amid the historical glut, worthy of a virtual reality blockbuster a la Dr. Strange. Trying to conjure up this image, circa 1930, blew Sigmund Freud's mind, although precisely the mind he had set out to prove in the opening of his Civilization and its Discontents closely resembled such an overflowing repository of intimate antiquities. Human interior knows no irrevocable deletion, he knew, but perhaps, he hesitated, his attempted analogy between a mental map and a speculative urban map was overdrawn. Traces of history in space, the psychoanalyst finally concluded, can exist successively but not simultaneously. Unlike the mind, and I quote from Freud, the same space cannot have two different contents. End quote. And yet it does. Physical markers of memory, as Andreas Huyssen pointedly observes, are less like a book with pages to turn and more like a palimpsest, a parchment recycled for inscription. Bleached through, though such an animal hide would have been, well before the age of print, in the long run, old ink would slowly manifest itself, as residual iron in its composition reacted with oxygen in the air. Ghosts of the past would then underwrite new texts, leaving the reader with no choice but to acknowledge the words and languages once so resolutely consigned to oblivion. Germany, too, has its share of ghosts, unseen, unremembered, unconfronted, the ghosts that we haven't been talking too much, or that don't make their appearance too much in the American, in at least the op-ed sections of American papers. Its past isn't merely the Nazi past, the one we know about the best. It is also not the past, not the Nazi past of Jews specifically, which we talk about a lot, but we talk a lot less about, the homosexuals, Sinti Roma, or disabled victims annihilated by the Nazis. So it's more than just about the Nazis. It's also about what they have been doing and how they have been commemorating the communist past, and even more so the colonial past. And these two pasts are still up for discussion. They're not closed chapters. They're not mastered. The challenge is not to master them even in succession, but to remember them all at once. Vergangenheitsbewältigung, notably, has come to aim not at finding closure, but accepting its constant deferral. Successful commemoration, and this might be Germany's singularly useful contribution, although unwitting and perhaps in part unwilling, doesn't close the wound, but finds a way to keep it open. Only something that continues to hurt stays in the memory, to quote Nietzsche's words. It is no wonder that scholars of Holocaust remembrance have redefined monuments, not as something fixed and permanent, but rather as, and I quote, communication processes of conflictual settlement about the interpretation of history, end quote. And what communication process can take place without attention to language, and without the means varied enough to reflect and trouble its complexity? Because precisely the need to trouble, and now I'm moving on to the second question about the language more specifically, is the goal with monuments. As we've seen with the Memorial for the Murdered Jews of Europe, a monument can bolster memory, and just as frequently, the same monument can fail. Monuments can be invisible, which manifests itself in several ways. Some are habitual, easy to overlook, and this happens frequently enough here, or this has happened even with the Confederate statues in the United States. They can get tarnished, they can blend with their surroundings, and that's one of the reasons why German citizens actually once a year, or maybe more than once a year, hold special days to polish the stumbling blocks, the Stolpersteine, because brass gets tarnished very quickly, rubbing them in ways reminiscent of devotional practices connected with religious relics. Monuments also can get dismantled. They can quite simply disappear, be deposed from their plinths, be melted down, though the most powerful, of course, never vanish completely. This happened to East Berlin Stalin monument, dismantled in 1961, and if those of you wonder why so late, it's because in 1961 Stalin was finally interred. He was taken out of the mausoleum where he rested next to Lenin and buried next to the Kremlin, along the wall of the Kremlin in Moscow. So that was, of course, an occasion to rush to dismantle its statues to him across Eastern Europe and also in East Germany and Eastern Bloc. After it had been melted down clandestinely, and there was a huge moral panic around what happens with its fragments, and the authorities in East Berlin were terrified. So it stood on the street that was then called Stalinallee, Stalin Avenue, avenue, I suppose, is the best way to translate this. They were terrified that the workers melting the statue would somehow abduct little pieces and keep them up as relics, so that operation was very closely supervised. And they had to melt it down so that ape and wapiti figure monuments, or not monuments, figures could be cast for the zoo in East Berlin. So they were going to make antelopes out of Stalin, in effect. And ape figures as well. However, the funny thing, if you read up on the anecdotes, is that these likenesses, eventually the rumors went around Berlin. They ended up speaking or roaring in dictator's voice at night. So if you sauntered in the vicinity of the Berlin Zoo, of East Berlin Zoo, you were very likely to hear Stalin's voice coming out of an antelope. Alternatively, and now we're on to the other slide, monuments can also slumber away, barely noticed against all odds, even though they're there, as has been the case with the so-called Hitler bell, inscribed with "Everything for the Fatherland, Adolf Hitler," which has only recently been made public in 2017 after hanging in Herxheim, which is a very small place in Rhineland-Palatinate, not very far from Mannheim, so fairly close to Frankfurt on Main. And it's been there in a church, Protestant church, hanging since 1934, undisturbed. One mayor resigned over the allegations of having covered it up, but the current mayor, the one who's currently in office, has argued for keeping the bell as, and I quote, "a monument to those who suffered under the Nazis," end quote, in the country that bans displays of Nazi insignia or glorifications of National Socialism. When this bell rings, that mayor said, "I hear the victims. These were German citizens, not just Jews." Monuments can also be invisible when nobody bothers to erect them, when they're absent, when some pasts aren't adequately honored. Berlin's controversial Humboldt Forum, which is, and here is process of its construction. I think now it's quite close to being finished, and now they're brainstorming about the collections more than anything. So it was constructed, as you see here, on the seat of East German Parliament, the Palace of the Republic, which was a kind of a concrete and glass building, very sleek and modernist, brutalist, you could say, even constructed in 1950, on the place of the former Kaiser's palace that was very badly damaged in air raids in the war and in the battle for Berlin in 1945. So there wasn't that much left on it, but the GDR authorities also consciously decided to kind of stamp it out by building a place for the people. And again, we're here with the people on the site that was monarchically coded before. So this forum is built to house collections that are supposed to present Germany globally, or kind of all the anthropological and ethnographic collections in Berlin are being rerouted and aggregated there. So what people have discovered in this rather scandalous project of aggregation is that a lot of the objects have questionable provenance. And of course, all this is coinciding also with the discussion of Germany's reparation to Herero and Nama, for the massacres in 1904 and 1905, and Germany has been resisting the calls to do the reparations, also been resisting the returning of all the artifacts to the former the countries who have sort of inherited the burden of German colonialism from where these things were illegally taken. And the current director, Patzinger, of this Humboldt Forum, said that every single provenance needs to be investigated individually, and you cannot just go and do what Macron has suggested for the French collections, just return them in a wholesale way. So this colonial past is very much open-ended, and there was just recently an acknowledgement by the German government last week that yes, it will indeed deal. So the new Merkel government that is being forged will finally deal with confronting the colonial past. And that is the first statement of the sort that Germany has actually made. Much less known than the Humboldt Forum is an example from Hamburg, where Karl Hagenbeck, who was a kind of a colonial adventurer, an explorer, an animal trader, had set up the first enclosure-free zoo in the late 19th century, pioneered these cage-free animal enclosures and sold the recipe to every single zoo in the world. So if we now walk around not seeing any gates around animals, this is Hagenbeck's merit. However, at the same time, this was also the first man in the world who pioneered human zoos. And the first human zoo was open in Hamburg. And so here, if you walk around the zoo, the Hamburg Zoo now, you run into very close to the entrance, or fairly close to the entrance into the sculpture of Hagenbeck. There he is with his lion Trieste, who supposedly saved his life when one of the animals, this is the danger of enclosure-free zoos, well, I suppose that they had moats with water that were deep enough for animals not to jump over. So imperiled were only the zookeepers and the director himself. So Trieste supposedly had saved him from other animals of prey, and for that he's remembered on this monument. However, Ethiopian man Hirsi Ege, who was a multilingual helper of Hagenbeck and also participant of these human zoos, which didn't just display humans in cages as we often think of human zoos, although Hagenbeck did that too because he sent his human zoo on tour, also on tour of America in part. But they had to reenact scenes from their life in sort of natural settings over and over again for the spectacle Hungary Germanized. So you would go to the zoo, it had two sections, one for animals, the other one for humans, that were separated by a street. You would go and watch sort of the authentic, quote-unquote, reenactments of lives in other continents. And they had quite a few different peoples and cultures represented there. So that population never received a monument anywhere in Hamburg so far, although the Hamburg Zoo has acknowledged its colonial legacy, and it doesn't quite register in the architecture of the city itself, though. In my field, German studies, these very shades of invisibility are a very well-known complaint. The Austrian writer Robert Musil opens his oft-cited essay Monuments by saying that aside from the fact that you never know whether to refer to them as monuments or memorials, monuments do have all kinds of other characteristics, and he goes on to list them. Among these, being conspicuously inconspicuous, and that's his term, looms large. There is nothing, he writes, in this world as invisible as a monument. Even the larger-than-life statues are barely noticeable, especially by comparison to such difficult-to-miss objects as dropped pennies on the sidewalk, he deadpans, let alone commemorative plaques engraved with indelible, quote-unquote, letters. This is the issue many Americans have come to discover. I quote from Musil again, "You would be momentarily stunned when they would be missing one morning, but you would never look at them and do not generally have the slightest notion of whom they're supposed to represent." End quote. Monuments, Musil goes on, are the great attention repellers. They are the white noise that one could block after a few hours. They make demands on us that run contrary to our nature. And I quote from him again, "Locomotives, after all, blow shrill, not sleepy tones, and even mailboxes are accorded alluring colors." End quote. In short, he jokes, monuments ought to try a little harder nowadays. It is easy for them to stand around quietly. Perhaps, and that's his suggestion, statues should hold up advertising slogans in the mold of, "Goethe's Faust is the best." The specter of language, which is reflected very subtly, but reflected as very often happens to language without being addressed. So language is the lubricant for many a conversation, yet it's hardly necessarily the topic of the conversation itself. So it can be very easily elided. So the specter of language has long haunted international discussions of monuments and monumentality. The famous 9 points on monumentality, which Ranjana has already cited, this 1943 manifesto-like proclamation signed by or authored by Ferran Léger and others, speak of the eternal demand of translation of collective actions into symbols, of powerful accents, and of lyricism. More recent attempts to capture the monument's trajectory observe a troubling, as they find, verbosity. In the essay, "Why Do Contemporary Monuments Talk So Much?" Del Upton, who is an architectural historian and archaeologist, asks about the compensatory verbal didacticism in contemporary public art. In representational figures of the past, before the turn to commemoration to negative form, he observes, visual language alone was enough, so you didn't have so much inscription on monuments. And think of Vietnam Memorial versus a 19th century statue. There, the wording is marginal or very limited. Other scholars, such as Victoria Gallagher and Margaret Lower, take up the question of rhetoric of public memory, yet, of course, they define rhetoric as the monument's own symbolic, material, and contextual and geographical resources, rather than its user's idiom. Such metaphorical treatments talk about public art without devising a public language for the purpose. And I'm moving on to conclude. By contrast, the literal preoccupations with language as they transpire, for example, and this is just a symptom of many discussions that occur in Germany, where you constantly have to negotiate the meaning of the word monument and ask what it actually means. So this is just a vibrant example. So this renegotiation transpires in Jürgen Habermas's essay, The Germans and Their Memorial, written about the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe. And they have a more instrumental, facilitating, and a challenging role to play. The essay itself is a rumination on how to apply, as he says, moral viewpoints in a non-selective way. So open up the Holocaust memory to all, not just to Jews and Germans, and also think of how immigrants who are coming into Germany can inherit that memory or maybe interact with it. And how to do so without regard to the public's belonging or membership or where they come from, without narcissistic fixation on the perpetrator's shame, without trivializing the victim's suffering. If the memorial is to prompt future generations, and those are not just Germans, but also all others who come to Germany to take a stand, Habermas notes, then it should be impossible to overlook, though it should not achieve this conspicuousness through monumentality, end quote. Notably, these points Habermas negotiates with the help of the aforesaid verbal arsenal that German as a language offers, and the translators and the editors, specifically Max Spensky, who is also a political scientist, they point out, or they make quite a bit out of this intranslatability. So, and here's the quote. In this essay, Habermas uses 3 related German words in connection with the memorial: Denkmal, Schandmal, and Mahnmal, whose lexical relation to the root mal is difficult to render straightforwardly in English. So we end up with this conundrum of intranslatability. Mahnmal, which means primarily a memorial intended as a warning from mahnen, does not have an exact English equivalent and is generally translated as memorial, though in one place we use the word admonition to highlight its specific monetary connotation. It is worth noting that, although the official title of the Holocaust Memorial is Denkmal, it is commonly referred as the Holocaust Mahnmal. So there are many ways in which one could renegotiate the memory without being stuck with any one word, and it's also quite obvious in this little quote that English just doesn't have a compatible lexical apparatus to reflect what's going on in a very saturated memory environment that America nevertheless has, despite not having the language to describe it. One could, of course, dismiss these philological meanderings as very ivory tower and endlessly confusing. And yet they're precisely the opposite. They put on parade vernacular words, so the words that everybody gets, with clashing, nimble, changeable meanings that need to be disputed and reconciled. That means continuing conversation. That means less invisibility. Traveling in 19th century America, the French sophisticate Alexis de Tocqueville observed that precisely such protean words characterize parlance in a democracy. And he talks about democracy, of course, but by that he just means America. They did get, he comes to America and writes on democracy in America and tries to come up with reasons for why he loves language in America so much and why he dislikes it so much. And he notes that, in a monarchy, the populace, and now we're back to the people are silent. It's only the monarchy that talks down and dictates the parlance. And yet you come to democracy, you come to America, and everybody's talking. Everybody's not only talking, but everybody's talking in their own discrete way. People are making words right and left. And so these words, the plethora, the proliferation of these vocabularies and steroids, it annoys them, and it also it annoys him, and it also inspires him at the same time. But in the end, he goes on to say that the genius of democratic peoples shows itself not only in the great number of new words that they put to use, but also in the nature of the ideas that these new words represent. So there is a kind of, the language and the ideas that it describes are communicating vessels. And of course, language and reality are communicating vessels. So how did the language to talk about monuments escape this revolutionary momentum, or at least perhaps democratizing momentum that the rest of language experienced in America, we might ask? Wouldn't the past and present monuments that aim to convey history's darkness without cheap palliative cover-up merit a language that accomplishes something comparable? Thank you.
I'm going to do that annoying thing where I ask a question about something that you didn't talk about.
Which is a lot.
And so, even though you talked about so much. So I'm thinking about what's been in the news about what's happening in Poland, right? And it seems to me that everything that you presented today could shed so much light on the situation in Poland, where it is precisely not like, I compare it to the Hungarian context, because that's something I know a little bit more about, and also the German context, which I know about, where there are a lot of debates about statues being torn down, new statues being put up. And so there is very much, and it is not a lot about language, right? It's a lot about, as you say, these monumental blocks of stone and what they symbolize. And then what has struck me so much about what happened in Poland, where they have forbidden certain claims about Polish responsibility in the Holocaust, is that it seems to be, on the one hand, consistent with kinds of right-wing rewritings of of Eastern European, Central European complicity and blame in the Holocaust. On the other hand, it's all about language, right? It isn't about a statue. It isn't about a physical structure. It is precisely, let us limit and talk about the way that, literally forbid certain kinds of speech in order to produce a certain Holocaust memory that we are happy with. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that in the context of what...
Talk about the case in particular?
Yeah, talk about the case in particular, and how what you are suggesting about the role of language, that the role of, because it does seem to me that you're suggesting that, okay, we should think more about words when we think about monuments, right? And how that helps us think about the Polish case.
Well, I think with regard to Poland, as far as I could follow it, and I myself, by way of full disclosure, I'm from Ukraine, where very similar, where the turn of memory hasn't been quite as problematic in terms of history, although it's not without its problems, but it's been perhaps similarly nationalistic, one could say. So there are definite parallels to it. And what I observe in conversation about monuments in general is that, yes, they do generate a tremendous amount of language that's very often handed top down, and this is definitely one of those cases where the government has written up very specific pronouncements in a law, in a very specifically worded law, that then went through, all at this point, the approval instances, and got rubber stamped in the end, yet this production of language doesn't come with a reflection on language, right? And this is something that, I guess that is my beef with how language is produced in a democracy, and that's perhaps Tocqueville's beef with it too, that democracies generate a tremendous amount of language, yet they don't generate the meta-language to talk about language, or perhaps they don't generate a forum in which there could be a reflection on language as well. And what I observe, looking at a variety of debates, that language ends up being this kind of an instrument. It's always a vehicle for something else, but it's never a topic in its own right. And so what I read in terms of the Polish case that struck me as most interesting is that people who write about it note how, yes, indeed, you can proscribe very specific kinds of memory, and you can say, you can talk about how people should be discussing the Polish case or Polish complicity in the Holocaust or the lack thereof, or whether one should say Polish concentration camps just because they were in Poland, even though Poland itself was not Poland, but the Generalgouvernement, and was dismembered again. So those kind of questions skirt the fact that, as somebody wrote, stones remember. And I found that such a fascinating point that, there are landmarks there, and perhaps that goes back to the passage that you cited. They're human monuments or human landmarks, and monuments are there even when we don't see them. And they don't necessarily always look like monuments. They're just sites that palimpsestically bury history, but it's always there to be uncovered if we only bother to uncover it, if we bother to peel the layers and bother to research them. And so I think that in Poland, that's sort of fascinatingly, the removal, I think a lot of discussions of counter-monumentality, to backtrack, has been seen as this very positive occurrence that can help dismantle the stodgy and boring monument that doesn't work, the 19th century hand-down that hasn't really proven itself effective. And that's how it's often considered, and by to do that, people go either to modernist, very clean-cut memorials that produce negative space, and we've seen the example from Berlin, or they talk about counter-monuments that performative stuff, the monuments that appear for a day and then vanish, or resignification of monuments that is temporary. But they don't really talk about, and I found myself that whenever I wanted to use the term iconoclasm, writing about what's going on in the public sphere, that word was always struck down. So, but iconoclasm is a variety of, it's a contra-monumental practice as well, right? It's when you face the memorial for a variety of reasons. It's neither positive nor negative. It's what you make of it. And sometimes governments instrumentalize it, and sometimes they don't. The French government in the French Revolution, after the French Revolution, instrumentalized it and sort of claimed it for itself for a while, as long as it was convenient and as long as it could fill the museums with the objects and the statues that were torn down. And then when it became inconvenient, it said that the Vandals are the people. And the same is happening in a lot of other places. But I don't know that anybody actually bothers to reflect on, what the variations of iconoclasm are. And I don't know that I'm answering the question very specifically, but
I mean, it wasn't really a question. It was more like you made me think more about this. Mm-hmm.
Like Kata, I know a lot about the German situation since I'm a Germanist. And interestingly, in a sense, as a resident of this country and born here and, having grown up here, much less about our actual American situation in terms of what kinds of monuments exist. And to think about the language that you've brought up here, what's interesting to me is that, so it would be wonderful if we had words with this range of meaning that would sort of help us to talk about the way in which a monument wants us to remember an event. Because that is, of course, what is so hard to express and what seems to allow this bizarre idea, which you also see in Germany evidently, but less frequently, as in the case of the bell, right, where somebody points to something that was erected to celebrate an event and says, we shouldn't tear it down because it'll make us forget this horrible thing that happened, right?
This is a mark of shame.
Right, in other words, it's a mark of shame. But no, wait, it was built as a mark of pride and not as a mark of shame. But what's interesting is that even in the German, as I'm thinking about all of these words the German does have, there isn't one that indicates that it's celebratory, right? So Denkmal has the very faint connotation in mal of being negative, but can be used certainly for a positive monument and has been and is, because it's basically a neutral word. Whereas Mahnmal is clearly a word that says this was built to admonish us not to do this again, right? And Schandmal even more so, right? This is a mark of our shame. The best you have for, like, we won this war, hooray, is Denkmal. Let's think about it. And in English, I think we have to make do with a single word, right? Monument, which I think is, in fact, I think you could use it really neutrally. You have to use a lot more language to describe what the status of that memory actually is. And so I think a major problem that we have in the United States, of course, is not only that people seem to be misunderstanding, in my view, the way in which celebratory monuments can't simply be turned to another purpose without effort, right? Yeah. But also, we don't have nearly enough Mahnmäler, right? We don't have enough admonitory monuments that were built for that purpose. So again, I guess not really a question, but I do think it's interesting. I guess I wonder if you've encountered in your investigations of language thought about what's the missing word here, right? Because it's not as if Germany doesn't also have celebratory monuments that people don't think an enormous amount about as problematic. Monuments to the victory in the German-French War, in 1871, or right. Nobody really says, "Oh, we shouldn't have those monuments. How could we have celebrated?"
No, well, actually,
they
should. So when the project for the memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe was proposed, there were 528 suggestions, I think, that the committee received. So as you can imagine, the competition was quite stiff. And one of them was sort of Stolpersteine-like. It was to build bus stops in Berlin that would transport people to actual sites where genocide happened across Germany and Europe. And one was to blow up the Brandenburg Gate and let that stand the sort of the ruins stand in commemoration. So to create that counter monument by dint of destruction, and that's actually also that's the logic behind many counter monuments that emerged in the Eastern Bloc as well. So when the statues were left half sawed up and or painted, or maybe there was a different description in graffiti on the pedestal very often, and sometimes they would be left prone. And we were just talking with Ranjana before the fact how in the Eastern Bloc a lot of people who were observing this kind of toppling down of Soviet statues, which was also illegal for a while because there was a law passed in 1990 against vandalism in the Soviet Union. But one artist said that the minute, so once you topple, it is not really an act of vandalism to topple a statue, because the minute a statue is prone, it becomes a sculpture. So it is actually taken out of, and that's a linguistic comment as well, right? And it's taken out of that sacred, the celebratory realm, and becomes something else. So you can actually get to language through these very indirect actions as well. And so how can you possibly make, and that probably applies here as well, right? Yes, on all counts, to your comment. I mean, I think that's precisely it. But I think the problem is, like with many words, especially words that tend to dominate. And now I know among political scientists, there is a huge discussion of neoliberalism, for instance. Is that a term that can still be somehow recuperated for use to describe the present condition, or is it completely, nil as far as we're concerned? And, some people have written it's really not about the inflation of words. It's about our lack of effort to redefine them, because, of course, monument doesn't have any celebratoriness engraved in it. It just means a reminder, but who thinks about it? And that's a problem. That's when it becomes a problem, that words like statues, physical objects, need to be resignified, and yet we don't really put the effort into the resignification because it costs effort, as you say. Recommemorating something means putting in the legwork and the labor of thought.
I want to continue our tradition of comments that aren't questions. I'm not sure that the invention of a word would make a difference. In the South, you can talk to any number of people who will contend to you that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. This is in spite of the fact that that word appears in every single secession statement passed by legislatures in the South. So people do a really good job sometimes of erecting their own version of fake news.
Yeah, and it's completely true. However, think if it's true if you look at history. However, if you look at specific monuments, there's nothing that speaks against a monument meaning many things at the same time. To many people, it's only that we finally run into the problem when it can no longer be an internal consideration for each individual, right? Where it needs to be said somewhere publicly, where the meanings of the monument need to be laid out in writing, whether it's on a plaque somewhere next to it, or some sort of inscription, or perhaps recontextualization of the monument have been being moved from the current location to somewhere else, and Richmond would probably be a good example of that, where they're consolidated with such crazy density. Right, new plaques or new locations, or parks of sort of demoted monuments, as Eastern Europeans have done in some cases. So something needs to give there, and statues, I'm actually not. I come to this project with having worked on iconoclasm of religious imagery along the Cold War border. That's my interest in it. And what I've learned from that is that, so basically when the Iron Curtain, the space for the Iron Curtain is cleared, the Czech troops, and I worked on the Czech-Bavarian border, so Czechoslovakia at the time and West Germany at the time, and to clear that space, Czechoslovak border troops and regular troops have to demolish a lot of churches. And so the question arises what to do with these imageries, what to do with the icons, with the surviving reminders of the people who inhabited those zones, and those people were German, and they were expelled, or they had been expelled before. So what do? They destroy some of them, and yet, of course, they're also superstitious, even though they claim to be atheists, and they seem to believe, having burnt a crucifix, they start feeling the symptoms. One of them ends up being poisoned and dies in a hospital, for instance. So there is a kind of divine retribution that haunts them, and so they stop burning these figures with time, and they just kind of put them across the border, or put them at the border for people from the other side to pick up, because this is before the border is consolidated. So it's supervised and kind of patrolled, but it's still flexible. And so what you observe is that ultimately, even the most destructive acts meant at tearing down the statuary don't necessarily all work, because the power of images, it lingers, it just gets transformed, it becomes something else, and it's difficult to wipe out. So I'm not necessarily a proponent of iconoclasm, having read up on it quite a bit, but I am a proponent of the fact that you cannot have celebratory. It becomes about getting rid of celebration. I think Eric Foner has spoken and written beautifully about this in the American context, that there is absolutely nothing wrong with keeping the statues with the contextual padding. You cannot just keep them there as they are. And people who choose to see the reminders of their, the lost cause or whatever in it, they can keep doing that, but it will have the different layers out there for everybody. And so, a descendant of a slave family can see a monument like that as a shandmal, as a mark of shame. And that's not currently there.
It seems to me in the American context there are a cluster of words that do some of this linguistic work. National landmark, historical site, war memorial. Those are phrases that carry some additional either connotations or get rid of connotations in a way to suggest that there will be a field of play for discussion around what exactly this national landmark means, or to whom it means and how it means. So I thought I might, what thoughts do you have on those kinds of terms?
That's very true, and I think that I mentioned that at the beginning. However, I think the problem there in the current context is that it sort of accommodates the both sides perspective very neutrally. It's very neutral because it's unmarked. All right, so national landmark, or national historic site, what does that even mean? And it's just it points to a geographical location. It doesn't append any judgment or value or historical assessment to it, right? And I feel that America is at the point when there's a need for that, when you need to have a word that you would in your mind, and that's where I'm not somebody who praises Germany ordinarily, but I do find the reservoir that German has in terms of this complexity of the word for monument that comes from a mark that's a very negative mark, and you have to kind of stop and think about it sometimes, because you've seen it in the word for birthmark, for instance, which is a very pedestrian notion, is not monumental at all, or mark of shame, or and it sort of opens up the possibilities a lot more. And I think that the neutral designations, I think that they exist, and it's probably good that they exist, but I don't see them doing the work. And I really think that we've arrived at the limits of their signification, if you want to put it this way. I don't think that they're wrong, and I think that this limited linguistic arsenal, it's manageable, and America's made do with it for several hundred years quite well, right? And several periods of intense monument erection in the times when there was kind of desire to force unity, perhaps, upon the nation. And it's forced unity, but it hasn't really accommodated all views of the past, and it hasn't generated much discussion about the past, right?
I've actually done a lot of work on Chiang Kai-shek memorials in Taiwan, which is a whole other kind of ballgame. But actually, I want to just bring back, I don't know if some of you were here for our end-of-year Story Lab event where we had John Jarvis, who was the former National Park Service director, and he actually came and talked about monuments from a kind of park management point of view, which is something I never really thought about. And I was wondering if you had done research on that, because it was really interesting how, for one thing, I didn't know that park rangers, and just shows I don't go into nature enough, but are always called interpreters and storytellers. And so part of the mission actually the main mission of the Park Services is that every park ranger and a lot of National Park Service properties are actually like Stonewall in New York City, so they're actually urban sites as well. But that the interpreters play, so the guides play a very specific role in narrating the language, the purpose of the monument. And so I think that for them, this is a very specific way of kind of giving context beyond a plaque or whatnot. So this is kind of, a thought of their mission. He also began by saying, we save what we value.
And is there protocol? Because
there is protocol, yes. So they're trained, they have scripts, and they revive those scripts, and they renew, they have meetings to talk about how to, sort of reshape scripts. So one of the scripts that they really had to reshape was around all sort of southern federal properties, right? So not local, but MPS monuments. And one thing they decided was that, like, for example, about 10 years ago, that they would not allow anything with Confederate flags anywhere in the perimeter of the park, right? So you have to travel far away to buy any souvenir with any kind of rebel flag type things. So I think that it's really interesting to think about the role that people play in these kinds of management of narratives around monuments. And so I was just wondering, I just think that it would be kind of fun to look at National Park Service and their history. Yeah. So because we certainly learned a lot when he spoke to us.
That's fascinating. I haven't thought about that. And that, of course, also speaks to the vernacular, right? Because the vernacular would come from the people ultimately, even though its moments, like in Martin Luther's case, were imposed from the top down. But then the rest was from the people, as Rendana said.
So actually, I just add one little thing, which is actually connected to your, the Holocaust, which I had seen as well. Is that in their 100th year celebration, they really emphasized social media. So they actually really encouraged people to use social media as a revival of these monuments. So it was kind of interesting to think about, obviously not every sort of monument selfie is going to, be respectful. But it was really interesting that they actually saw this as a way of updating their stories. So I don't know, which is opposite from, in some ways, the Holocaust.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Yeah. And can I just shoot a question back at you? And in terms of the Taiwanese case, because that's also fairly recent, right? Could you?
Oh, yeah. So one of the things that happened in 1992, so when the first DPP was elected, there were a lot in 1992 and then 2000, a lot of monuments. Every school had a Chiang Kai-shek statue. And so they were all taken, people wanted to get rid of them, but then Sihu, which is this area in kind of an hour drive away from Taipei, said, we'll take them all. And they made it a tourist park. So basically there's a park that has hundreds of Chiang Kai-shek memorials, including one that was dismantled in anger. So it was just pieces. So they actually display the pieces. So that park, but of course we're in another cycle, so parties have switched twice again. And so now they're talking about actually dismantling that park. So right now, but the park has actually functioned really well as a tourist site, and interesting enough, mostly for mainland tourists. So PRC tourists who go there to see kind of the other path their life could have taken. So that county was very smart because it became, their tourist draw. So they just took all the statues. Yeah, and that happened in Moscow. There is a sculpture park, and in Budapest and the Baltic countries, they have these, and they've also kind of capitalized. Yeah, but now with the second round of TPP, I think rightly so, people feel it's too raw, and then the argument is for destruction. So, and I think that has brought up all the emotions again about that. And that would just be complete erasure. Then. Yeah. So that this was even too respectful way of treating what people perceive as war crimes, right? War criminals. So that's interesting. And if you walk in Germany, there are these there's a fortress outside Berlin where the capitulation treaty was signed. It's Spandau. And if you walk around Spandau, there's this kind of back alley where they store all the sculptures dismantled from the park, and they're the sculptures of the greats from the 19th century, and actually not even from the 19th century, starting from the 17th century and onward, and they're just kind of parked there in the alley. But it's not even something that you would pay money for. It's not something that you would capitalize on. They're just there as a kind of maybe a thing to discover, a stumbling block in its own right, perhaps. And I think that we have very few of stumbling blocks as well, where you would find a shattered statue and you'd have to ask questions about it. I think everything's so whole, and I think the language is also so whole, unquestioned, and monolithic. And I think it's sort of the parallel between the monolithic language and monolithic statues sometimes becomes bothersome. Although I think it was great that in the context of the Confederate statue tear down, so many counter monuments have come up where, there's a famous monument, I think, to Stalin. I might be wrong about that, but it's in Budapest, where there are only bouts visible. And then you can do with that what you will. You can interpret that in any way. You can say that there are big shoes to fill if you're somebody who's glorifying Stalin, or you could just say that, there are only the traces left. And that's also, it opens up the field of interpretation to a variety of views, but not single one that's kind of dictated from above.
I don't know that that's necessarily the success recipe for the American case, because I think that, to be quite honest, people just need to recognize that slavery was wrong and racism was wrong, and there are no two views about it. But if they want to see their personal families' roles in fighting wars in those less top-down, stately or state-dictated narratives, I don't know. Perhaps that could be a choice still for them, for the more ambivalent pasts that their ancestors may have played with choice or without choice. I don't know enough to say about that. But it seems bizarre that there are these unlabeled statues just standing there and glorifying the past that's completely unglorifiable.
I feel like, none of us can choose our parents. So everybody's going to valorize, from whence they came. And I feel like it's less about tearing down monuments as opposed to ensuring that the psychosocial trauma that's been visited upon repressed people is addressed in such a way as they feel comfortable posting their own monuments. I wouldn't care about a Confederate monument if I could see a Nat Turner monument somewhere, honestly. And so, I feel like I don't feel like it's like about validating slavery so much as just acknowledging that we all have ancestry and we will represent it if given the opportunity. And our choices of representation will change with time and space. I have some friends where we make clothing, and we've been taking Southern symbolism and repurposing it, reappropriating it. Red, black, and green Confederate flags on T-shirts. Anybody? And North Carolina state seal has Hestia and Demeter sitting with the cornucopia, and our state motto is Esse quam videre, which means to be rather than to seem. And so we just browned Hestia and Demeter and put dreads on their heads. Just commentary on Afroasiatic origins of classical civilization. And I was wondering if outside of the actual hard thoughts of monuments, if anyone's been appropriating symbolism and repurposing it, or is it inappropriate to appropriate what's inappropriate?
You mean in the German case, or?
Context, yes, ma'am.
I'd have to think about that in a very specific way. Well, it's interesting that for the Stalin statue that was gone, right? In 1961, it was melted down to make those animals for the zoo. Now Berlin has organized an exhibit to mark the 65th anniversary of Stalin's death, and they were looking for a Stalin statue that would be comparable in size to the one that had stood in East Berlin once upon a time. And of course, they couldn't find it anywhere because they were all destroyed. And surprisingly, Russia hasn't yet erected its new Stalin statues, even though it has a kind of an up-and-coming cult of Stalin returning right now. So they scoured the globe for it, and they found one in Mongolia. It was parked in an inner court of a businessman's private home. And for some reason, and Mongolia was, of course, kind of a Soviet-dominated state where the Soviets had quite a bit of sway because, in part, they had to protect them against the Japanese invasion in 1939. So the dependency started already then. And so that statue was borrowed for the exhibit to display the kind of the overstated grandeur that would have been typical for its time. But before it was installed in the exhibit, it was brought and laid down on the former location of the statue prone for 30 minutes as a kind of a prone statue living there. Sort of you appropriate, because removing these communist statues, especially in the East German context, was a very fraught notion. I think in countries like Poland, and also in the former Soviet republics like Ukraine, a lot of these communist statues were seen as a top-down imposition, as especially because there was an iconoclasm wave that the communists have waged to remove all the national statues after 1917 or whenever the Soviet republics got added. That was a long process. And then the Soviets instilled their own monuments, and they were seen as intruders. And so when the opportunity came to take it down, people did. But in the GDR, it was a little bit different because it actually had quite a few communists who were native and who wanted to build communism in the GDR. So the removal of those statues, especially of the Lenin statue, in 1991, I think, was extremely contentious, and a lot of East Berliners were truly holding on to it for dear life because they thought that this is where their memory lives. This is the memory of state building, their personal memory. So we can't choose our parents, but we want to see ourselves represented somehow in that state. And so for them, that was a very contentious moment. So bringing in a moment and just putting it down is a kind of a sign of acknowledging that it had been there, but it doesn't quite mean. Because monuments are about power, ultimately, right? And you want to decenter that power. You want to, in a democracy, you want to give power to the people. And so consequently, people, if they want to erect monuments, they should be able to erect monuments. But that's not, in effect, what's happening. And that's not what's been happening in America with counter-monuments, because I think you have a case in Baltimore when in front of a Lee statue, there was a counter-monument put up of, I think, of a Latinx woman at some point to commemorate slavery and women and the difficult fate of migration, slavery, and womanhood in America, and it stood there for a day, and then the police took it down right away. So there isn't that space to create counter-monuments, and I have to think harder about the German case because I'm quite sure there was this resignification going on of statues or reappropriation of statues for people's own needs, but I just can't think right now off the top of my head of a more specific example, but I'm quite sure that there were some. And even these counter-monuments, leaving the shoes standing there, but taking the rest of the statue out, or painting in Ukraine, they painted some of the colors, some of the statues, the colors of Ukraine's flag. Some of the communist statues were painted yellow and blue, which are Ukrainian national flag colors. So these kind of living with appropriation has occurred there, but I don't know that there are too many countries that have sustained it. In other words, these have been very impermanent marks. They are there for the time, and then the assumption is that people have expressed their will, they have protested, they have resignified. Good, now we can remove it, right? And I don't know whether that's the point, because there's a huge discussion in the field of people who are studying monuments, whether monuments should even be permanent or should be allowed to remain permanent, whether it's worth to invest in something that will be rethought so many times because there's constant historical revisionism, and I don't even necessarily mean revisionism in the bad sense. I am using it here as historians use it, that you need to reconsider history consistently, and monuments should reflect that. So no monument is ultimately permanent. So I don't know if if maybe we should have sort of equal rights for all monuments, and the idea would be that all monuments would be short-lived. For instance, they would just occur and commemorate for as long as people need to feel represented, and then they would just go away and new monuments would come up. A kind of a more spontaneous, perhaps, response to the problem rather than trying to commemorate for an eternity and perpetuity.
This may actually link also to the question of story, which stories which aren't documented, right? Stories that vary, selfies that are taken that are irreverent in a variety of different ways, right? And how we think, in some ways, about the relationship between the kind of the monumentality of analog in relation to the impermanence of digital, right? And what kind of work is going on now in the digital realm that is absolutely a confrontation with the monumentality of analog, and is in many ways, I mean, certainly there's the meme that went viral around, monuments that people want, right? And that's something that's sort of come up quite a lot. So I'm interested sort of technologically, right, in how one thinks of the massive concrete block, right, in relation to this work that seems ephemeral or at least impermanent, right, in the way in which you're maybe talking about.
I think there was a pretty famous case in the last year in South Tyrol. I think it's in Bolzano, where there was a a very monumental structure erected under the fascist regime, which is still there, and the locals wanted to resignify it, to reappropriate it. So what they have decided to do is projection. So that goes into the kind of intangible, not quite virtual, because it's not occurring in virtual space, it's real time. And so they have been projecting all sorts of things on it, the victim names, the quotes from people like Hannah Arendt, anything that would be a reminder, and ultimately creating, and I think that was profiled in a variety of media as well. I think where that ultimately succeeds is creating the layers, or that multiplicity of layers without, you really can't see any which one passed in isolation. You can only see them as a palimpsest at the same time. And I think that's what's so stunningly effective about that no past is, well, at least these particular pasts aren't untainted and could only be seen through the veil of taint, right? So, because we can, of course, this is where the preoccupation with language becomes a little bit, a bit of an ivory tower issue, because we can resignify memorials and monuments with language all we want, but ultimately they stand there unquestioned, right? So how do you make them questioned? And I think that artists have been doing that, have used projection quite a bit, and I think that was one of the most successful cases of decentering this monumental fascist memory with making the other memories unavoidable. At the same time, not just having one monument of one sort and another monument at the same next to it, which I think still allows for different people to think about the different pasts in very different ways, and it doesn't actually forge any kind of unity, which is ultimately the mission, right? I mean, if the mission of monuments is to create at least a national conversation or semblance of a conversation that everybody's having rather than just one segment of the population. I'm not even talking about creating any kind of national or unity or but the point is to create a conversation. So how do you create a physical environment where people must experience the same reality at the same time? I think there was a question somewhere there.
A monument that is not celebratory, and if it is, it's very obvious. Not something like the Berlin monument that, if you didn't know what it was, you wouldn't know that it was a shame reminder. And any of the repurposing or redefining of monuments that have fallen from grace have been grassroots as opposed to populace. And I don't know, I just think it's kind of un-American to even think that way. No.
But is that connected to, I mean, that's why I asked about the language. I mean, right. It's the American word monument to yoked, the word monumental,
right.
which is celebratory and big and imposing and full of grandeur and whatnot. But I also, one could say, and you're absolutely right on this point, but one could also say that they weren't born this way. Celebratory veneer, if you will, has accrued to them over time through multiple generations that have celebrated them in parades, through top-down imposed, top-down pageantry of the Cold War, for instance, that has also sealed the construction of many of these monuments, in sort of the second wave of monument construction in America. So there's nothing organic about them having to be celebratory. It's just that we have all made them this way. And now we have to unmake what we've made. So how to do that? And that's why I started wondering about the question of language, whether it might have to start with that. If we take down the concept that allows us to think of a monument as monumental by necessity, which is not what it means. It just means a reminder. It's extremely neutral, as Stephanie has noted. It's vacuous almost, and you can fill it with any kind of content. And if we don't redefine that somehow, and if we don't have maybe a plethora of other words to go along with it, then we're going to be stuck.
Vietnam War Memorial, where I go and see it and I feel shame, and others go and see it and they feel pride. And that's the only example I can think of that has this kind of duality to it.
And it's also a monument with which you have to interact, which I think is quite important. And that's what's worked with the Stolpersteine, because you literally have to take cloth and polish them with your own hands. And I think that's how many people have interacted with the Vietnam Memorial. They have come with paper and pencils and have made the rubbings, right? I'm not saying it also exists in other places done completely uncritically or without any kind of personal engagement. Like I remember in Westminster Abbey, for instance. In England, you would come and rob things for no good reason other than take a souvenir. But I think these personal interactions, they might spur personal engagement with the monument, and maybe the problem is ultimately that we lack monuments that require this kind of personal investment and interaction. And I think there are plenty of performance art, performance artists who are confronting that as well, who are trying to make them participatory.
Thank you so much. This has been a really rich conversation, and
Thank you so much.
really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for the comments.